welcome everyone. My name is Fiona Bruce and I'm a Member of Parliament in the UK Parliament, and I'm Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Pro-Life Group, a group of MPs and members of the House of Lords. I'm speaking to you from the House of Commons in the UK, where it's currently 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm delighted to welcome our two speakers today, Dr. Stuart Derbyshire, who's speaking to us from Singapore, where it's 9 o'clock in the evening, and Mr. John C. Bockmann from New York, where it's 8 o'clock in the morning. So thank you to both of you. We really are privileged to have you speak to us today. And your invitation follows the publication of a journal article which you produced in January this year, and which coincided with the publication of a report from our all-party group on fetal sentience and pain. The all-party group spent some time looking at this issue because we felt that current UK guidelines regarding fetal analgesia for abortions were now ripe for review, if not indeed out of date. And so our report sought to establish and I'm quoting from it now, the state of current evidence regarding fetal development and activity, identifying how that evidence informs clinical practice and whether current legislation, information and professional guidance is in step with medical advances over the past few years. And our full report can be found online. It's online on my website, fionabruce.org.uk. It's also online on the website of Lord Alton, davidalton.net, one of the long-standing members of our pro-life group from the House of Lords. Now, this is a challenging issue, we recognise that, which is why we're so pleased to have expert with us today. But the APPPG report, we did conclude that there was very much the need for updated guidance. We were interested to note that the government here in the UK not long ago acknowledged that unborn babies undergoing surgery for spina bifida from 20 weeks gestation now receive pain relief. Of course, the same age at which some babies can be medically aborted. And so, as we've said, we believe that this underlines a requirement for Parliament to review this whole area. The last time our all-party group looked into this was very many years ago. And notably, it's not just the UK that acknowledges now that babies can feel pain in the womb, as we have done through the direction regarding the surgery requirements, but also there are guidelines from other countries which are looking to recognise this more and more. And this is why we're so interested to hear from our international speakers. At this time of a global pandemic, many are raising questions about the importance of life and humanity, and we believe it's all the more critical to ensure that the unborn are not forgotten, as every life is intrinsically valuable. The evidence that babies can respond in the womb, that they can respond to sensation, highlights, we believe, the humanity of the unborn child, and provides yet another important reason for legislation to be looked at again with regard to protection of the unborn child from abortion, and indeed during the abortion process where they are carried out. We recognise that there are divergent views, but that is why we are so interested to hear from our speakers today. We're interested in the report that came out that was produced earlier this year from our two speakers, and we want to hear more about the science behind their views, behind concerns about fetal pain, and the evidence that led them to conclude that it is possible that the unborn may feel pain from even as early as 12 weeks gestation. So each of our speakers will speak for 15 minutes, and we will have a question and answer period after that. And so without more ado, I'm delighted to introduce in a little more detail our first speaker, who is Dr. Stuart Derbyshire. As I say, joining us from Singapore, where he serves as an associate professor at the National University of Singapore. And since 1990, he's worked with imaging technologies, where a major aim has been to understand what the brain does when someone reports pain. Having recently turned his direction towards the nature of pain, he asks, what is it exactly? Does it develop, or is it delivered by the stimulus directly? Noting it is his hope that by better understanding what pain is and the brain mechanisms that support pain, we can provide targeted psychological and pharmaceutical interventions. He's been published in several journals, including the British Journal of Health Psychology and the European Journal of Pain. So welcome, Dr. Derbyshire. We look forward to hearing from you now.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I will need share screening if that's possible. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. Give me a thumbs up if you can do that. Yep, thank you, John. Okay, great. So thanks for the invitation. I'm going to spend about 15 minutes explaining the changes in my understanding of fetal pain since I first started writing on this. I do divert from the British spelling of fetal after this slide and drop the O. I can't cope with the silent O. Apologies for that barbarism. Okay, but so the fetal pain debate for me began with a Lancet publication from Professor Fisk's group at the Queen Charlotte Hospital in 1994. Their study measured cortisol and endorphin responses during direct fetal needling, and the authors claimed that their findings of elevated cortisol and endorphins raised the possibility that the human fetus feels pain in utero. I was then in the process of obtaining my PhD, and I wrote a rebuttal, and that became my first publication. It wasn't intensely sophisticated, but it at least captured one of the arguments that is still running today. Pain is a complex arrangement closed off to the fetus, I wrote. In essence, pain is psychologically complex, but the fetus is not psychologically complex, and so fetal pain is unlikely. I followed that with a slightly longer article in the British Medical Journal and stated, scientific evidence suggests that women considering abortion can be assured that fetuses do not experience pain. Pain becomes fully formed after birth. And then a slightly longer article again in the BMJ a decade later, which stated, pain relief efforts are unnecessary for fetuses who have not yet reached a developmental stage that would support the conscious experience of pain. In 2010, I was a member of the expert panel that reconsidered the evidence on fetal sentience for the RCOG, and we concluded, in reviewing the neuroanatomical and physiological evidence in the fetus, it was apparent that connections from the periphery to the cortex are not intact before 24 weeks of gestation, and as most neuroscientists believe that the cortex is necessary for pain perception, it can be concluded that the fetus cannot experience pain in any sense prior to this gestation. I was never fully comfortable with emphasizing neural development, and even as that RCOG report was going to press, I was still continuing to develop my position. So in a further review in 2010, I wrote, whether it is possible the fetus can sense a noxious event without understanding that I'm in pain remains open to debate. So even then, for anybody paying attention, such as my co-presenter today, John Bockmann, there was evidence of some wiggle. A year later, I wrote a more extensive review with my student, Anand Raja. Anand, incidentally, is now an assistant professor back in India, and he does not support the views that I expressed in my JME piece with John, nor my comments here this afternoon. Nevertheless, at that time, we wrote the following. We recognize the disquiet in denying aurora, more primitive form of pain or suffering. Both an older infant and the fetus might be said to feel pain, whereas only the older infant can experience that they are in pain. So what are the major issues being contended? I think there are three central issues that opponents of fetal pain have rested their case on. The first is that the fetus in the womb remains in a sleep state that is incompatible with pain. We don't feel pain in our sleep, and so if the fetus is asleep, then it can't feel pain. The second is that the fetus in the womb does not reach a sufficiently mature state of neurological development. That is, brain development is not sufficiently mature, at least not before around 26 weeks, for pain experience. And the third is that the fetus in the womb does not reach a sufficiently mature state of psychological development. Psychological development is not sufficiently mature at any stage of gestation to accommodate the complex nature of pain experience. In the time I've got left, I will explain how these foundations have become wobbly. In 2005, David Mellor, not of Parliament fame, but of Australian chic neurophysiology fame, wrote an excellent review suggesting that the fetus sleeps throughout gestation. First, he argued that the physical, warm, dark, buoyant, and chemical, the adenosine environment of the womb places a strong emphasis on immobility, sleep, and protection. And then that when under stress, the fetus does not awake, but enters a state of deeper quiescence. And so he concluded that the fetus never wakes, and so the fetal pain debate can end because we do not feel pain in our sleep. Brilliant, very clever, and tremendously annoying because I had spent years developing what I thought of as an nuanced argument about consciousness, neural development, and pain. And Mellor came along and said it doesn't matter, the fetus never wakes up. But my annoyance only lasted a couple of years until I took the time to look more closely at Mellor's data and arguments. Here is a key piece of that data that Mellor leaned on. The top shows brain activity in an untreated control animal, whereas the bottom shows the response in an animal treated with an adenosine antagonist that prevents the action of adenosine. After cord occlusion, you can observe that blocking adenosine prevents the neuronal quiescence seen in the control animal. Except the quiescence is relative and not absolute. You can also observe a large spike of activity in the control animal. Rather than brain silence during stress, there's a shift from one brain activity pattern to another, and we have no direct means of assessing what either pattern means in terms of experience. Typically, we define sleep in terms of the brain activity pattern that is generated, but those patterns don't exist in a newborn or the fetus. A newborn can sleep with their eyes open and has as much brain activity when sleeping as when awake. Long story short, we don't really know how to define sleep, especially not in newborns. There is no unequivocal break from wake to sleeping, and we have very little idea of how neural activity relates to consciousness and sleep. We can't say that the fetus sleeps throughout gestation. My work and that of many other groups gave rise to the idea of a pain neuromatrix. Here's the essential idea. Stimulation at the periphery, and less often in the viscera, will activate spinal neurons. A secondary sensory neuron continues into the thalamus, where at least two thalamic nuclei are excited, the VPL and the MDVC, and perhaps also the VMPO. Those nuclei project out to different cortical regions. The VPL projects into primary and secondary somatosensory cortex, S1 and S2, associated with the sensory component of pain. The MDVC projects into the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex and the insula, along with projections from the VMPO. These areas are broadly associated with the emotional and cognitive components of pain. Each colored circle represents where studies have reported pain-related activation, and until recently, there was a fairly strong consensus on the involvement and presumed need for those areas to generate pain. But in 2016, Tim Solomons and colleagues reported a remarkable study of two people born congenitally insensitive to pain because they completely lack the necessary peripheral fibers that detect stimuli that threaten tissue, known as nociceptors. When receiving noxious but not painful mechanical stimulation while being scanned, they activated the pain neuromatrix as shown. Thus, Solomons proved that activation of the neuromatrix with noxious stimuli does not necessarily spit out pain experience, but it might still be the case that pain experience requires the neuromatrix. Except another paper from the same group examined a patient with widespread damage to the anterior cingulate cortex, insular cortex, and some secondary somatosensory cortex, and demonstrated that this patient still feels pain. From this study, it remains possible that cortical activation will deliver pain, but they now demonstrated that pain does not rely on the cortex. These two studies largely dissociate pain from the cortex, at least enough for me to reconsider the central importance of the cortex. The International Association for the Study of Pain, the IASP, defined pain a few decades ago as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. And in a note, they added, pain is always subjective. Each individual learns the application of the word through experiences related to injury in early life. Although the definition has undergone some minor changes and new notes have been added, pain is still broadly defined professionally as a subjective experience involving sensory and affective components, which did mesh quite nicely with the proposed Neuromatrix for pain involving a large cortical contribution. One thing John and I had to do in our recent paper was escape the enormity of the ISP definition, which we did in the following way. As others have pointed out, we wrote, such a demanding definition of pain restricts pain almost exclusively to fairly mature human beings. To ease that restriction, it might be worthwhile to consider a less sophisticated definition, which focuses less on subjective reflection, knowing that I am in pain, and more on the immediate raw phenomenological feel of pain, being in pain. So that feels like a distinction that can work, but it's not without maybe obvious problems. I don't know how I could rule such a sensation out or in, but John and I both agree that whatever the fetus might feel, it certainly isn't what the ISP definition describes. One problem is that pain is just too big a term, and because it is quintessentially subjective, we only know for sure that we are experiencing it. So let's look at some different pains and start with something silly. A sausage on the barbecue will bend. That's a purely physical reaction due to the collagen shrinking and bending the sausage. Nobody except the extreme panpsychics argue that the sausage feels anything. Next up is the humble fruit fly larvae, maggots to most people. A maggot will curl up and roll away from an open flame, which is a biological peristaltic reflex. And not many people believe that amounts to pain either. It gets trickier as we ascend the phylogenetic tree. The dog has a biological flexible response, responses that can alter with cognition. The dog does not presumably reflect on the pain and worry that it may never have full function of its paw again, but it has some raw immediacy that is akin to pain experience. And then there is us. We have a metaflexibility. We know about our thoughts and feelings. We are self-reflective and know that we are in pain. In closing, I still believe that development matters. Before 12 weeks gestation, pain doesn't make sense. The brain is profoundly immature and the free nerve endings or nociceptors are probably absent from most parts of the body. After 12 weeks, we enter the terrain of a possible raw and unknowable pain experience, something apprehended in an immediacy, but not comprehended in a reflection. From birth onwards, these raw states of being can be explicitly recognized by a caregiver, and the infant can interact with others. Games like peekaboo entertain the infant. The game isn't articulated, of course, it's bodily, but behind it is an abstraction that really matters to the infant on an emotional level. The infant continues to shift from bodily action and expression to internal actions, thoughts, reflection, and understanding. Profound changes in psychological being that will matter to how we feel. There is movement in mind from the reflexive to the reflective. Feelings now become explicitly known and articulated, and then Nietzsche kicks in and the real pain of being begins as the infant transitions from being that to knowing that. And that's all from me. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Derbyshire, for that really factual, fact-packed report. We're very grateful to you, particularly with the scientific, long-term scientific background which you've had looking at this issue. So we'll come back to you with questions if we may shortly, but I'm going to turn now to our second speaker today, Mr. John C. Bockmann. Welcome. You're welcome to join us from New York. You're a medic by profession. You're a US Army physician assistant, a former teacher, and erstwhile Black Hawk pilot. With Stuart, Derbyshire, you wrote Reconsidering Fetal Pain, the piece in the Journal of Medical Ethics in January 2020, which so interested our pro-life group. And this, as we've heard, suggested that fetal pain could be possible from even as early as 12 weeks. You're currently a member of the Connor Troop Medical Clinic at Fort Drum, New York, USA. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Bockmann, Mr. Bockmann, from America's East Coast. Welcome.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. You see everything? I'm good. Okay. I'm new to this. I was in Afghanistan while you all were having COVID, so this is new. All right. So this is the case against COVID, fetal pain. And it is really more of a personal angle on this, Stuart's and my unlikely collaboration. So briefly, agenda, myself, how Stuart and I got together, and I'll go into a little bit of detail about what I found with RCOG's 2010 report, and I'll rebut it just a bit, and then we'll conclude. Let me see if I can make this work for me here. Get my notes up. Apologies. All right, can you see? Okay, so this is not coordinated. All right, at any rate, so there I am as a teacher. That's my background. So I was a teacher for 5 years in Southern California. I do love kids, and really, what else was I going to do with my literature degree? Be a writer? Well, I did do that for a year as well. For those of you who are wondering, this is me right there. After that, I enlisted as a Black Hawk. Actually, I went to be a student once again for a crack at a commercial pilot's license and another degree, and then I became a pilot, and there I am in Pakistan, flying through the valleys of the Indus River during the floods of 2010. And midway through flight school, oh, there we are. Midway through flight school, I married my neighbor and got her pregnant, in that order. And there we go. I don't know how to get this. I'm having a little technical difficulties here, but there is the result. That's, can you see that okay? Okay, good. So that's Emily inside her mother, 8 weeks and probably 20, 24 at some gestation there. And then she's outside in it. At some point I began to dawn on me that this was the same person on the inside as she was on the outside. And the idea was small, like Emily herself, but the more she grew on me, the less I wanted to live in a world where we could destroy her, to put it bluntly. There she is. Charlotte came along in 2014, and here they are. Emily and Charlotte, no relation to the Bronte sisters, and it may not be obvious, but I'm a bit fond of them. I had been in aviation of some kind since 2002, but I'd always loved medicine and had been flying medevac for a few years when I decided it was time to be a physician assistant. It seems logical in that I wanted to do it. But right around 2015 is when David Daleidon's Planned Parenthood's videos came out, and having 2 young daughters and studying the human body in order to heal it, I was overwhelmed with the images of tiny war-torn babies. And that's the actual term the doctor used in the video. The videos began to crush me, and every day after leaving the classroom, I'd feel the tears welling behind my eyes, and I'd get to my car and finally let them out. Then I'd pull myself together and drive home to my family. Fetal pain was in the news at the time and highly contentious, and some of those babies weren't that tiny. I wondered if they might have felt pain as they were torn apart. Now, I knew nothing about fetal pain, whether it was real or political ploy. I like to have an educated opinion, and since fetal pain was a medical topic, I decided this was a chance to get smart on it. So my academic advisor, bless her, agreed to let me switch topics from obesity to fetal pain. And that's what led me, months later, into a most unlikely conversation. So I started studying fetal pain obsessively. One name came up over and over, SWG Derbyshire, had written or was cited in practically every research paper and textbook I could find in the mid-1990s and beyond on pain, or in general, not just fetal pain. And one thing stood out to me plainly. He liked a good fight, and he was much like myself. I saw myself in him in that way. And when I saw things like anthropomorphizing fetus, that really got me, because I said, well, the fetus is already a human. How can you anthropomorphize a human? And so I started to read him a little bit more carefully. And then I saw this. Let's see if I can get these coordinated here. So the one thing that really caught my eye, though, was a New York Times 2013 article in which Stuart seemed to walk back his original opinion that he had voiced in RCOG's 2010 study, wherein I call it the fetal sleep hypothesis, wherein the fetus, we heard him discuss it, is in a conscious or a continuous state of unconsciousness or sedation. And he said, that seems like it's a really appealing argument, but unfortunately, I don't think it quite works. So that stuck in my head, and I've turned it over and over again over several months as I continue studying. And then my thesis became due, and that's when I took the liberty. I was like, well, it's now or never. I've got to email him and find out what the deal is behind this comment. So I said, dear Dr. Derbyshire, what's with this? And then to my surprise, he emailed me back. And then I emailed him back. I started getting bolder. I was asking questions. I was telling him my thoughts, and he was like, he wasn't saying I was crazy. We didn't always agree. In fact, we didn't agree on a whole lot, but it was really interesting to me. So fast forward a bit, and I'm ready to graduate PA school, and Stuart, I wind up in New York, and Stuart winds up in New York City at NYU giving a talk on fish pain to a consortium for the animal consciousness of NYU. And that was pretty bold of him in retrospect, because the audience was not really all that receptive to it. But we hit it off pretty well there, and we got along really well. And it's formed the basis for everything else I think that came after that. After that, like, I felt a little bit more free to speak my mind to him. And that's when I really got into the case against fetal pain. And with him, I really became more frank in talking about RCOG 2010 in particular. And RCOG 2010 has two main points. What I call cortical necessity, which is the idea that cerebral cortex is not connected to the thalamus before 24 weeks. It's not you cannot feel pain until it's connected. So cortical necessity, the cortex has to be online. The next one is what I call fetal sleep. The fetus is lulled into unconsciousness of some kind in the warm, buoyant, cushioned environment of the uterus, wherein there's adenosine, which also sedates it, such that the fetus will never awaken. So this was partly, as I think Stuart touched on, based off of fetal lambs being observed for 5,000 hours without observing any signs of wakefulness. And but the problem with that is the adenosine, pregnant mothers also may have high adenosine levels, but without any anesthetic or sedative effect. Also, the warm, buoyant, cushioned environment, this wouldn't prevent anyone from awakening to actual trauma, so that doesn't seem to apply in the case of abortion. And the neonatal sleep and awake EEGs, which Stuart also really nicely elucidated, and he was the one who clued me into this because he wrote on it and he shared it with me. They're essentially the same. And he also said that the meaning of fetal EEGs are really uncertain. It's not really, we don't really quite know what to make of them. So we can't really pin our hopes on a sleeping EEG for the fetus, essentially. So also, what really stuck out to me was RCOG 2010 says fetal sleep highlights the potential pitfalls of extrapolating from observations of newborn preterm infants to observations of the fetus. But fetal sleep is an extrapolation itself from a different species to the human fetus, which really seemed incongruous to me. And I'm surprised I haven't heard that before, but that really bothered me. So then we're on to cortical necessity. And this is just a rough outline of the human brain. The spinal cord on up to the thalamus, which is represented in that little yellow oval there, and then the cerebral cortex. Cortex means bark in Latin, and it's really the outside kind of convoluted part there. This is the front. So thalamocortical projections, the nerve fibers coming from the thalamus to the cortex, emerge by 24 weeks is what we found. And this is the opening summary of RCOG 2010, where it says, as most neuroscientists believe that the cortex is necessary for pain perception, it can be concluded that the fetus cannot experience pain in any sense prior to this gestation. That sounds all well and good, but if you look carefully, it reads to me like the conclusion implies that the conclusion may be concluded. And the rest of the paper is apparently superfluous. But let's read on. If most neuroscientists believe in cortical necessity, there must be a reason for it. RCOG 2010 would substantiate most neuroscientists, and the evidence must be strong and abundant, right? Well, it so happens, in my opinion, and I present this to Stuart as well, RCOG 2010 does not substantiate most neuroscientists, and the evidence provided for cortical necessity is surprisingly equivocal, and there's not much of it. So to illustrate this, I broke down the 5 references that purport to cite cortical necessity. They're number 3 and 4, and 52, 53, and 54. You can see the passages on the left and the references on the right. And I'll break those down momentarily here. So references 3 and 4, neither one of these was relevant at all to cortical necessity. They're completely different topics. So it seems to have, they seem to have been cited in error, I would say. The references, the next 3, the final 3, 52, 53, and 54. Franson's paper, reference number 52, is irrelevant as well. It deals with resting states of the infant brain. No big deal, but it doesn't support cortical necessity. Now, 53 and 54 are not so clear. Both small studies, they may support cortical necessity. The number 53 showed correlation between silent angina and subcortical activation, plus angina pectoris and cortical activation. So we know correlation is not causation, but it could definitely support cortical necessity. And Coghill, number 54, showed alterations in pain intensity linked to alterations in cortical intensity. So there's a correlation there as well. Small study may support cortical necessity, but again, as Apkarian actually addressed this, activation patterns vary by study, stimulus, and imaging technique. In my opinion, Stuart may have a different one on this. It's not very robust. So in summary, cortical necessity in RCOG 2010 equivocally supported in 2 small studies. Other 3 studies are irrelevant. And there's also significant evidence against cortical necessity, some of which Stuart's presentation covered. So I basically put this to Stuart in an email, and this is the end of that email. I said, our ACOG, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, says sound health policy is best based on scientific fact and evidence-based medicine, not political ideology. And I said, I agree, but since cortical necessity is neither scientific fact nor evidence-based medicine, what is it? It's a working axiom. It's not a scientific finding. The 2010 report glossed over this fact, and I think the world deserves to know. So it's pretty blunt. Your friend, John B. So long story short, a year and a half later, well, Stuart, okay, I won't jump that far. Stuart was like, well, maybe we should write a paper. I was like, what in the world are we going to write on? And so we worked through that. We found something to write on. And a year and a half later, I was out in Singapore writing this paper with him. And he sent it up on 11 July 2019. And that was our paper. So in conclusion, SWG Derbyshire is not the closed-minded partisan I expected. From this, I take encouragement to reach out to my ideological opposites. I think that's a very serious point, especially today. And finally, RCOG's 2010 weaknesses and its central findings, in addition to new research presented today, would be well addressed with another iteration. And I will stop my share.
Well, thank you so much, John. Thank you for that moving presentation and journey of your consideration of this issue. And we're particularly pleased to have you explain that to us, and also you're working with Stuart, because the conclusion of our report was very clearly that the RCOG 2010 guidance, which states that the provision of analgesia, of pain relief, is not necessary for abortion at any gestation period, needs to be reviewed. And to have your views from the two of you as people who've looked into it in such depth is so encouraging. And so now I'm going to assess the questions that Abigail's going to illustrate, maybe coming forward to us. And to perhaps start off, I would be interested to ask you what your thoughts are now on what we should perhaps specifically be putting to RCOG, and indeed as parliamentarians to our health ministers here in the UK, about how they should indeed reappraise this whole area and this whole approach, and what recommendations should be given to indeed to mothers considering an abortion in the 21st century today.
Were you addressing that to anyone in particular?
Yeah,
or Stuart, you want to go? Yeah.
Shall I go?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I mean, I think this is where John and I are going to disagree. I mean, in my opinion, it's worth gynecologists taking another look at this issue for their own interest and for their own, professional reasons. But I think ultimately it's such a vague and uncertain thing that we're talking about that I don't believe we should mandate any changes in medical practice. I would say that it's perfectly reasonable for the woman in consultation with a clinical team to act on their own conscience and do what they think is right. I'm not against that. But I wouldn't want to mandate any changes in law. But having a professional look at it is never a bad thing.
John, I wonder if you have any comment, and if perhaps you might comment on the view taken by Professor John Wyatt, who told our inquiry that he said, I think we should play safe. I think we should give the fetus the benefit of the doubt. We should assume that it is capable of experiencing pain and unpleasant sensations, and we should then treat the fetus appropriately, which would, if necessary, be with strong pain relief, medication, or anesthesia.
Fiona, I do think that is a very reasonable approach. It, to my understanding, fits well with the precautionary principle. I know that Stuart disagrees from his perspective. He says, well, that also applies to the pregnant woman. I would say, I think that reasonable precautions can be made in administering fetal anesthesia. In fact, as long ago as 2005 with the JAMA article with Lee and Rosen and colleagues, they even went into a few different methods of administering fetal anesthesia, including intraamniotically, intrafetally, and of course, through the pregnant woman, the mother. It seems like that's not going to be sufficient, but directly to the fetus or through the amniotic fluid may be a possibility. Just reading JAMA 2005 and other articles on the topic. Now, of course, more research needs to be performed to ensure this can be done safely, but we already do similar procedures with feticide agents. So I don't think that it really represents a cognitive leap at all to accomplish this.
Thank you very much. And just continuing on from this, are you able to inform our UK parliamentarians who are listening in about any steps which may be being taken in other countries with regard to reviewing this area?
Stuart?
Can't say I can at the moment. No, I mean, obviously all the big moves have been made in the States, but it's outside the United States. I don't think there's any country that's looking to review their policy on this particular discussion.
I will say I will say this, the state of Utah here in the United States, back in, I think it was 2016, passed a law mandating fetal analgesia anesthesia. It was very light on the specifics. In fact, I think there were none. I think that was one of the criticisms, but I think it's also a strength. It leaves the door open to find out what ways may be best of administering fetal anesthesia. But so far as I know, it really has not been enforced.
That's very interesting. And I wonder if you have any comments on the comment in our report that in this country, it's a strange but true fact that animals have more protection than the unborn child in this regard. A dog fetus at 7 weeks gestation has more protections in law than a human fetus about the way that they can be put down. Don't you find that a rather disturbing point?
Stuart, you know what I'm going to answer. I want to hear what you answer.
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess it's true. That's an anomaly in the law, but you can iron out anomalies in more than one direction. So you can reduce the protections on animal fetuses, or you can increase them on human fetuses. I think you can make an argument in both directions, frankly.
Thank you. Now I've got some questions here. There's a question here from James Evans. What is your opinion on hypersensitivity? Papers that show that newborns and unborn babies may be 4 times more sensitive to pain. And then another question. France and USA have some fetal pain guidelines. Do you know of any more? So I'll ask whether either of you would like to respond to either of those questions.
Sure, I'll take one. The fetus being a little bit hypersensitive, or I think it was newborn being hypersensitive. Yeah, is that what he said, James? Yeah. So, and Stuart, jump in anytime and correct me on this if you feel the need to. But this has been a pretty well-known, or at least well-discussed idea for some time now, for decades, in fact, that the fetus and newborn are hypersensitive to pain because they do not have the descending pathways fully functional yet. And by the descending pathways actually inhibit the pain response, the periaqueductal gray and so on. So I don't know if there's been anything more definitive in that in recent years, but I know that it is certainly not a bizarre left field idea. It's certain, and judging from a newborn's response, I would agree that they seem to be hypersensitive to a great many things. Stuart.
Yeah, but it's a behavioral hypersensitivity, and this is always the problem we run into. So maybe there's a feeling behind it. How we define that is hard to really get to grips with. We struggled with this. And as we did discuss, nature isn't often perverse. It would be a bit perverse to put you in a state of greater pain at the time when you're coming down something that's quite compressive and quite unpleasant. So I don't know where we take this and how we precisely understand it. But yes, the cortex is not fully developed at birth, and it doesn't have that damping response that it usually has for behaviors later in life.
Mm-hmm. I would say this, if I could tag on to what you said about more pain coming down through the pelvis. We do know that some degree of pain and stress response improves the fetus's chance for survivability outside. It helps to clear the lungs and so on. So the pain of experienced by the fetus during birth is maybe salubrious, good for the fetus. So there's that. So that may not be as perverse as it first appears.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I have a question from my parliamentary colleague, Dr. Lisa Cameron MP, who perhaps from the nature of her question you might perceive has a medical background. She asks, is there an element of cognitive dissonance regarding these issues in the medical profession?
Go, Stuart. You know what I think.
Well, you know, I would like to know a bit more exactly what you mean by cognitive dissonance. But if you're talking about an abortion procedure, I mean, in that procedure, most medics who perform it see the woman as their patient for obvious reasons, and it is the woman's life that they're trying to help. So no, there won't be any cognitive dissonance if that's your point of view.
Thank you.
Now, I do. Obviously, the fetus is a patient in all other contexts. So I think if it were only so easy to turn off one part of our brain thinking one way and the other part think the way we are in that particular situation, I just don't think there's any evidence that we can truly do that. So whether we acknowledge it or not, I do think there must be cognitive dissonance. And listening to interviews with certain abortion providers, many of them actually do feel this, quite a few.
Thank you. I have another question now from another parliamentarian, Sally Ann Hart MP. What is your view on the advice that fetal analgesics should be given from 12 weeks?
Well, we cover that in our paper. Stuart's like, well, I'll let him answer for himself, but we did answer that in the paper. I think that 12 weeks, it's reasonable. I don't think it's necessarily should be mandated, but mandated possibly 18 weeks and beyond, where there's good evidence that everything's all wired up and we have good experience with fetal anesthesia, 18 weeks, even 16 weeks, frankly, in the operating room for therapeutic fetal interventions. So I think that's quite reasonable. And I think even a mandate is reasonable at some point before mid-gestation.
But John, it's that even for fetal operations, it's not mandated. It's good clinical practice, right? Yeah. So I worry about this idea that lawyers should be telling medics how to do clinical practice. I think that's
we do that all the time. Yeah, we do that all the time. Well, frankly, medical law is long and distinguished, and it's a very highly litigious field.
I get it, but we don't give anesthetic to fetuses in operations because the law mandates it.
Yeah, we do it because we care about them.
We do it because of clinical, it's clinical benefit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I worry about introducing yet more laws, if you want to put it that way, to medics do. I don't think that's necessarily a good way to do medicine. And then I think beyond that, I also worry about the implications of suggesting that a fetus at 18 weeks or whatever requires an anesthetic intervention, what that will mean for birthing. You know, I mean, it does become a bit tricky to deal with the birth process if you're arguing for a fetal anesthetic.
I think not all. And the RCOG 2010 itself addresses that very directly. And I alluded to that earlier, that the pain of a fetus being birthed is actually beneficial by all appearances to that fetus. Now, it's something that we could consider, but it's certainly not obvious that that pain is harmful to the fetus at the time. It may even be helpful, as it appears to be.
Well, it's fascinating to witness a discussion between two experts. Can I ask you further question that we have? Have you read the All-Party Parliamentary Group report on fetal awareness, and if so, what was your opinion of it?
You go this time, John.
You get the right of last answer. So I thought it was a beautifully produced, very beautifully produced. It was a brochure, I guess, is what you'd call it. But I thought it was factual, and I didn't take any issue with it at all. And I agree with its conclusions. But then again, you're preaching to the choir here. So.
Yeah. I'm slightly embarrassed. I haven't read it, so I can't. That's why I haven't looked at it yet.
Thank you.
I will.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to hear that you will. A final question as we come to the end of our time is from Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, Member of Parliament, and he's asking, as legislators, how can we more effectively utilise the research on fetal sentience to help recapture the narrative on abortion from a pro-life perspective? Perhaps, John, you might like to comment on that one, please.
Okay, so this goes back to humanizing. So I took issue with Stuart and his term anthropomorphizing the fetus. I took issue with that, but in a very real sense, that's legitimate. So Jeremy Bentham long ago said, the question is not, can it think, but can it feel? And long ago, the little medallion with the slave on it said, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So what those ask us to do is consider the humanity of the other, to empathize. And we empathize by various means. Stuart can go into this more than I, with mirror neurons and so on. But I think it's inborn greatly. And I think if we deny our ability to read the actions and nonverbal cues of humans, if we deny that, then we deny something inherent in ourselves. I really do think that we need to highlight the humanity of the fetus by whatever means are appropriate, and this is certainly one of them. The ability to feel pain is visceral and undeniable to so many people, and I think that that's honestly a good technique. If the fetus couldn't feel pain, I think abortion would obviously still be wrong, but this is a good way. This is for those who are not yet convinced.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we could take that as a very eloquent final comment from John. And Stuart, just to give you an opportunity before we close, would you like to make any final comment on this whole area?
Well, I do think that's an interesting point you finished with there, John, because I've always argued that the fetal pain argument really has very little to do with the abortion arguments. No, abortion isn't about whether the fetus does or doesn't feel pain. I don't think you're going to change your mind if I can prove that it doesn't, and I don't think I'm going to change my mind if you prove that it does. We both support abortion and don't support abortion for different principles and different reasons. So my personal feeling is I'd prefer to keep this out of that debate as much as possible. I'm not naive. I get it. It's going to be involved, but that's not what we're arguing about. Pain is not a moral barometer that will waive and will solve the abortion question.
Well, thank you very much to both of you, Dr. Derbyshire, Mr. Bockmann, for giving up your valuable time today for what was a fascinating session. Particularly appreciated you taking the questions that you have and allowing us to engage with your discussion. The All-Party Parliamentary Pro-Life Group very much believes it's important that we continue to educate ourselves and others on this important issue, and which is why we've so valued your expert contributions today. We do also hope, as we say in our report, that we will see the current RCOG guidance on this issue updated. We very much believe that that is something that we ought to, as humane society, do. So thank you for enabling us to broadcast concerns about this issue more widely through this webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us, and to Abigail Foreman and Right to Life for assisting us in the delivery of this webinar today. Thank you everyone, and goodbye.